Hey y'all, it's Jackie Sawicki here with another episode of the Proof of Waste podcast. Today we have a special guest, Dave Troy or David Troy. He is a tech entrepreneur, a journalist, and also a historian. So he's got a really interesting perspective on crypto and our moment in history right now. So Dave, thank you so much for coming. Welcome. We really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jackie. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit just now before the cameras came on, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you found your way into the crypto sphere?
Yeah, sure. So I am a technologist sort of by background. I've been starting, technology related companies since I was like 14 years old. And I've really, been present since the formation of the internet. I was one of the early internet service providers and hosting companies. So I really have had a front row seat to the whole development of the internet, just by virtue of kind of when I was born and all that. So over the last 10, 12 years or so, I've started to get more into doing a lot of online data analysis, trying to understand really, how the internet works and what it can tell us about how communities form, and where extremism might develop, all that kind of stuff. So as I started studying that in like 2010 to 2012 timeframe in really detail, lots of things have happened. So there's been the development of quite a bit of online extremism, and we've had election manipulations, and that kind of put me right at the front lines of all of that. So as a result, I've worked with a lot of journalists and other writers to kind of get stories developed and figure out what's going on. But there just came a point where I realized that the only way I was going to be able to tell the stories that I thought were most important when I wanted to tell them was to really dive into the field of journalism myself. So I started working more. For the last few years, I've been writing for the Washington Spectator, and I do a column there. That kind of gives me an outlet to express some of the stuff that might not otherwise make it out through other channels and try to get ahead of some of these things. Because all too often the issue is that we're reacting to this stuff rather than actually getting ahead of it. So I'm trying to do some of that. And as far as, crypto and whatnot is concerned, I've been watching that since it developed as well. And, I got interested in what was going on with like Bitcoin and Dogecoin and stuff back in like 2011, 2014. My son was doing a lot of Dogecoin mining, which I helped him with because it was an interesting project and I wanted to understand more about it. And as that technology has evolved, and as I learned more about where it came from, I became much more opposed to the aims of the project, as well as to where it's going, the direction that people are trying to take it in, and realized that it was actually really harmful to democracy and to the country, and very much aligned with a lot of the online extremism that I'd also been studying. So that's kind of how I got to this place.
Yeah, thank you. I almost every podcast I bring up the fact that this isn't a neutral technology. I always reference David Columbia's book.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Bitcoin, like the politics of Bitcoin, right-wing extremism as a software. It started in like 4chan. And can you actually like elaborate a little bit on that? Because when I talk about right-wing extremism, I'm not talking about traditional conservatives and Republicans. I'm here in Texas. I'm not attacking anyone like that. I am talking about like really, really dark forces on the dark web that are really working hard to undermine our democratic institutions. I would love for you to talk about that.
Well, and some of the resources, like you mentioned, like David Columbia's book, get into some of the online origins more than I have. But what I can tell you is that you're right. I mean, a lot of this kind of came out of right wing, and even more than right wing. It's more like extremist views about how money should work. And kind of these dark enlightenment, neo-reactionary kinds of circles. So, you've got people like Curtis Yarvin that everybody's been talking a lot about lately. And, I've been following him for, I don't know, 10 years or something as we've seen this unfold. But the thing that is kind of important to understand is that a lot of this stuff that unfolded online, which, honestly, if you go back to say, the early 90s and some of the internet news groups. This is some of the youngsters today don't know about internet news groups, but as an old timer, what I can tell you is that, there used to be this thing called Usenet, which hosted a lot of these kinds of message boards. And they were sort of like email threads that you could like answer and reply to. So it was kind of like Twitter, kind of like email, and very distributed. It was kind of a distributed version of Twitter almost that ran its own protocol called NNTP, and there were all these different news groups in there. And there, a lot of the discussion there was about cryptography and puzzles and stuff like that. So a lot of the people in that kind of world, kind of what people used to call the cypherpunk world, started looking at this problem of currencies and whatnot in some detail. Starting in like the late 80s, early 90s, I mean, this was when the internet was tiny and really restricted to educational use. And then as the internet grew up, these, sort of early discussions amongst really cryptography freaks, and again, to distinguish between cryptocurrency and cryptography and understanding that they're quite different, people started to come up with, ideas for like, well, how could we come up with a money transfer system that would be independent of banks and would rely on cryptography and not require any kind of central entity, this sort of thing. So that challenge kind of got posed around that time frame, and then it was really answered anonymously by Bitcoin and some other related proposals. And a lot of people argue about where specifically the Satoshi ideas came from and who all that belongs to. And to some extent, it sort of doesn't matter. And the point that you're raising here, though, is that this stuff is actually a continuation. Like the question around this that was posed in the late 80s, early 90s didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of longtime frustration with central banking, the Federal Reserve, and arguments over the gold standard. And people that, sort of are familiar with 20th century history know that the gold standard was a big deal in the 20th century, and that one of the main arguments between sort of liberals and conservatives was about money and the gold standard. So this goes back to 1933 when, the Depression was in full swing and Franklin Roosevelt comes into office. And one of the first things that he does in March of 1933 is to basically ban the personal possession of gold. And of course, this pissed everybody off because, they're like, oh, you're telling me I can't have gold? And the idea was that in order to print enough money, if you will, to fund the New Deal, you needed to have as much gold as possible in the US Treasury. So they were trying to basically vacuum up as much gold as possible, as well as to kind of disempower some of the very, very wealthy folks who were using their possession of gold as a way to kind of challenge the government and to keep the government in check. So there was this tension between people that were sitting on a lot of gold, which were really industrialists and other kinds of old money people that just were wealthy and they thought they were above all this. And, there's the government that's trying to fund things and dig us out of the Depression and whatnot. So this opened up kind of a portal when Roosevelt did this into this like bifurcated universe where there's people that are like completely obsessed with gold and the problem of scarcity. And then you've got people that are like, actually central banks are fine and managing interest rates is good. And so this is sort of the difference between, Keynesian economics and more Austrian school economics. So Friedman and Rothbard and all these Austrian types that later became closely associated with the University of Chicago School of Economics. So that's what Bitcoin is about, is trying to answer in a technological way that kind of schism that got opened up in 1933. And hardly anybody understands that. A few people do, but most people don't grasp that because it's being marketed as technology, not as a monetary religious difference, if you will.
Yeah, but if you are in those circles, the 21 million scarcity thing is one of the biggest.
It's huge, yeah.
It's huge in the Bitcoin maximalists, and that's why they say Bitcoin, not crypto. Like it's supposed to be.
And they're always, saying like end the Fed and all of that.
Yeah, audit the. We were just having a little conversation about that on Discord this morning about the obsession with the Fed.
Hmm.
And scratch the surface, and there's a little bit of anti-Semitism because of
Yes,
the
quite a bit.
association
And a
with
lot of people would not own up to it because they don't understand that that's right there under the surface. But if you dig even just a little bit
tiny.
and look at this underlying conflict, it's right there. And I'll give you an example of it. This morning I was watching a video that was recorded in 2009 of an old man who, in 2009 was a very old man named Eustace Mullins. And Eustace Mullins wrote a history of the Federal Reserve in the 20th century, about 1950, and became, as a result, kind of a hero of this like gold bug right wing group that was obsessed with the Federal Reserve. And he was also talking with another guy named Willis Carto, who was basically the mentor to David Duke, the KKK guy. So what you find, is that this network of people that are obsessed with this problem, has historical legacy. It goes way, way back. Now, you can trace it into like Hamilton and, all of this kinds of early conflict in the US, but especially to the Civil War. So in the Civil War, obviously you had the Confederacy and the South seceding on grounds of slavery and all of that. But if you look at the network of people that actually was really promoting secession, it was a group called Knights of the Golden Circle. And the Knights of the Golden Circle was obsessed with gold. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to have the southern states secede, and they obviously did, but then they wanted those states to merge up with a bunch of states in Mexico and in the Caribbean to create a circle, right? And within that circle, two things would be law. Gold would be the currency, and slavery would be legal. Okay, so if you think about slavery, not so much as a system of like free labor, which it was obviously, but there's a really good book called Scraping by a historian at Brown University named Seth Rockman that makes this point, which is that slavery was actually a system of capital and a system of property, and it's a system of wealth transfer, intergenerational wealth transfer. Because when you have a plantation owner that owns X many slaves, and the main slaveholder dies, and then the son takes over the slaves, those slaves all have huge capital value, right? And so it's a mechanism for generational transfer of wealth that then created the conditions for this kind of massive wealth disparity between slaveholders and slaves, certainly, but also slaveholders and, say, the other bourgeoisie who didn't necessarily hold slaves. So it was a way of kind of perpetuating wealth inequality. And so anyway, this Knights of the Golden Circle, that group, was very involved with the sort of formation of the networks that led to the secession of the states in the Confederacy. And then they also, in turn, were the foundation of the network that assassinated Lincoln. So basically, there was a barber here in Baltimore named Cipriano Ferrandini, where the barbershop that he had was like the meeting point for all of the Knights of the Golden Circle folks in the area, including John Wilkes Booth. And so they would all get together and hang out and talk about gold and whatnot, and then they went and assassinated Lincoln. So, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but just to give you the idea that there's this huge continuity between like 1860 and, 2009, and it was really, if you look at the origin block on Bitcoin, embedded in that is the headline about bailing out banks. And so this is basically, haha, we finally got you. We finally got you, bankers. You're not going to be able to get out of this one. And of course, when Bitcoin came out, people, myself included, were kind of like, well, this seems like a weird little project. I wonder if this is going to go anywhere or not. And I remember hearing about it like on NPR in like, in 2010 or something, and thinking like, oh, I wonder if I should, put $100 into Bitcoin or something just to see what happens, thinking that it was just sort of one of these little experimental tech projects that doesn't go anywhere. And little did I realize at the time that it was this like project designed to undermine the government, undermine the Federal Reserve, and that left unchecked through network effects, that's where we would end up. And that's where we are today, that's what people are rooting for, is exactly that.
Yeah, in almost every podcast episode, I also say it boggles my mind that any elected sitting US representative is touting this stuff when I see it as extremely seditious, treasonous, anti-American technology. So when, my representative, Senator Ted Cruz, announces he's mining Bitcoin, it's just like, why
Yeah,
are
he should
you?
be like charged.
Yeah, yeah, it's
You know?
so it's so infuriating, because there is like I feel like what you said, there's kind of a bill of goods of what they sell to the public, and then there's its actual foundational use case and ideology behind it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the thing is that people just don't understand it. So what I think we have going on within Congress right now, and certainly we're seeing it with some of the presidential candidates too, is that there's people I think who do understand the stuff that we just talked about, at least well enough to know that what they're up to. There's other people that are sort of joiners or who are sort of going along with this because it sounds cool, and then the people that are leading the charge, they're copacetic with. So, within the House, there's like a, blockchain caucus, I think. And then you've got a bunch of senators that are now signed on to this. People like Cynthia Lummis are leading the charge. And you've also got like Thomas Massey in the House, who's been pushing to, he actually proposed a bill to end the Federal Reserve. And that's not going to go through right now, but under a new Congress with a different makeup, it might. It's stuff that we have to be really cognizant of. And in fact, that's a recommendation within Project 2025, is that they pass a bill that outlaws the Federal Reserve. And people think, well, how can you do that? Well, because, the Federal Reserve was authorized by legislation in 1913. So you can unauthorize it with legislation just as easily. It's just that you have to pass it, and that's only a matter of engineering the outcome in Congress. So, it's kind of crazy times we live in. And then, on the Democratic side, I think there are some folks, people like Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, and a handful of others who are sort of either embracing crypto or crypto curious, or maybe claiming to give crypto some lip service. And these people need to be educated. I would say they need to be slapped around a little bit, but, let's be gentle. They at a minimum need to be educated. And I think that they just don't understand. I think if people were to understand that this is the ideological successor to the Klan and the Knights of the Golden Circle and the John Birch Society and, the Liberty Lobby and a bunch of other very not so favorable organizations, then they would get the message that this is something that they shouldn't even be flirting with supporting. Now, I do want to carve out a little tiny exception that, there probably exists, just because I'm a generous person, there probably exists some blockchain technologies and projects that are not intending to overthrow governments. And to the extent that they're willing to submit to some basic common sense, laws and regulation and, taxes potentially, then whatever. I'm not really concerned with those. The ones that I'm concerned about are the ones that are trying to overthrow the government and are using ridiculous amounts of energy to do it. That seems like a real problem. And I think we need to get ahead of that. And my other belief is that if you were to, let's say you put a heavy, heavy tax on like Bitcoin, and sort of cause it to go away because it's just not practical to participate in it because it's just not profitable, then I think that would kind of kill the Bitcoin mining problem also. And then I also think that a lot of the sort of, downstream coattails kind of energy that goes into a lot of these other crypto projects would also lose a lot of oxygen, because there would be less incentive to sort of create these what people call, and excuse the expression, but shit coins, where people are trying to, get rich quick, and do other things that are just sort of Ponzi scheme-ish. I think if you could kill the big Ponzi scheme, then the other sub-Ponzi schemes would sort of melt away to some extent. But we have to be really cognizant about what these things are and just how dangerous they are. And so far, I think we're only beginning to sort of spread that awareness. So podcasts like yours and things I'm doing, I think are helpful in helping to raise that awareness. But that's kind of where we are.
Yeah, and the National Coalition Against Crypto Mining, one of our main goals right now is to educate as many legislators, especially because it's an election year, especially because the crypto industry is spending as much, if not more, than the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, just record amount of money spent on the primary a anti-crypto Democrat. So they
Yeah,
are
in Arizona, there's a woman that's being pushed by the crypto lobby, right?
yeah, Arizona, Katie Porter's opponent.
Mm.
There was another one I think in New York, but they are spending tremendous amounts of money to install pro crypto, shills, what I would call shills, and
Sure.
boot anti crypto or crypto skeptical, or even just people who want transparency in the industry. Um, a lot of us believe that if they had to come into regulatory frameworks, if they were actually regulated like securities and assets that they are, most of them wouldn't pass the smell test. Most of them are, scams. And then what you said about Bitcoin's absolutely correct. Anytime Bitcoin takes a nosedive, all the other shit coins, meme coins, those also go down. So, and
Yes, yeah.
because Bitcoin mining has become so massive and concentrated, there's a definitive certain price point of Bitcoin where if it goes so low, it's just not feasible for them to continue mining it because it costs so much to run all those computers and waste all that electricity and money. And if Bitcoin is at a certain price point,
Right, there's no ROI.
yeah.
Which is
So
why I argue for a Bitcoin tax ultimately. I think that would be a really good thing that the United States could do to keep this in check. And just do it as a wealth tax on Bitcoin. And the tax has to be payable in dollars, and it's an annual tax, and you lose 50% of the value of the asset every year, and then it goes away. Like that would be the way to do it. And if you don't, convert, if you don't pay your tax and you do tax evasion, then, you go to jail. It's
yeah.
problem solved,
So comment and question. The Biden administration did propose an excessive energy tax called the DAME tax. So Bitcoin miners would have had to pay extra to use electricity, which usually they're getting like discounts and special
Yeah,
long-term.
they're finding ways to get cheap energy. Yeah,
It's criminal, except it's allowed. So we're very much in favor of that, and that is why the crypto bros hate the Biden administration so much, is because they actually care about the planet. They have been, I mean, there's a dichotomy of us drilling more natural gas than like ever before. But also they do have climate goals, the Biden administration. So the Dame tax, and then Gary Gensler,
yeah, they hate him too.
hate
Yeah,
him so much. So they essentially view the Biden administration as adversarial, and that's kind of why they're backing Trump. We are nonpartisan, but we will shout out the folks who are protecting the public and the
sure.
planet.
I mean, you have to tell the facts the way they
Yeah,
are.
yeah. And so my question was um how are we supposed to tax it when one of the whole like draws of this was evading taxes? How do we know?
Well, so I think the way that you have to do it is first off, put the law in place and say, look, here's the deal. You need to self-report. Now, granted, self-reporting is not sufficient, but in the event that they try to convert it out into dollars, they're going to have to go through an exchange, and they're going to have to go through a bank. And if it turns out that in the process of that they reveal that they've been holding these assets for X amount of time, which is totally traceable because Bitcoin, then you can basically say, okay, you've been evading taxes for 6 years, and you're going to get this big of a fine. And if you don't, I don't know, you get charged with a crime, and if you get convicted of the crime, then you go to jail, and the judge can decide how long you're going to go to jail for. And maybe there's some mandatory minimums, but I mean, I think that's the kind of hardball approach that probably needs to be taken with this. And, I mean, they're going to complain about that a lot. They're not going to be happy about such a law. But I mean, I think that at the end of the day, that's kind of what needs to happen, because otherwise you let this sit here and fester. It is like an infection. It is a wound. It is going to kill the patient if it is not kept in check. And the reason for that is because, as you said, there's so much influence being put into buying politicians. And if you get past a certain tipping point within Congress or any other regulatory situation, then it's game over. And these folks will take over. And what will happen, because a thing like Bitcoin, because of the 21 million and the scarcity and all of that, number will go up. And as that number goes up, you're going to give this network of people, which is a minority, leverage to destabilize the entire economy. So when these people are talking about worst and best cases for Bitcoin, when they talk about in 2030 or 2050, Bitcoin being at a floor of 150,000 or 28 million or whatever fantasy numbers they come up with, the amount of leverage that those people would then have to act on destabilizing the economy and also capturing Congress people would be massive, all the while vacuuming money out of the dollar system that could be going to productive things, and also potentially wiping out people's savings, destabilizing the dollar, all the bad things that we think might come with that. So you think if it's basically a pyramid scheme versus the rest of the world. And so how do you deal with a pyramid scheme? You make it illegal. Now, again, you can outlaw mining. I don't have a huge problem with that. But to me, the more elegant solution is to tax these assets heavily, because it will also generate revenues. As we're just outlawing mining doesn't generate any revenues. And it also forces the conversion of crypto assets into dollars in order to pay the tax, which in turn lowers the price of the assets, which in turn crushes the market, which is really the goal. You want to get rid of this thing because it is a pest, it is an infection.
I love this solution also because it's kind of poetic. It would be poetic justice in that they hate taxes so much.
Yeah,
And the
and
way
like,
to
ooh,
undermine it.
whoops, now you have to pay a lot of taxes. Sorry,
Yeah, like
And it would pay down the national debt even,
yeah. Oh, we got to talk about that too. But it is funny because right here in Navarro County, the Bitcoin mine company that I'm fighting is Riot Platforms, and they were promised behind closed doors that they would get property tax abatements on $12 million worth of property. They say that at the end of this project, it will be worth $600 million, and they weren't expecting to pay taxes on that property. And now, our group rallied the troops, and we made it extremely clear to our county commissioners, our Navarro County commissioners, that we did not want them getting property tax abatements. And so now they are like threatening the public, saying, well, if we don't get these abatements we were promised, we might not be able to keep expanding or hiring. So they were, number one, they were not expecting to pay about a $6 million tax bill, and it could be like it's undoing. So I think, again, like the fact that one of the whole points of this technology is tax evasion, and even in Bitcoin mining, it's a huge part of their business plan, is like not paying for the infrastructure and the society that they're getting to operate in.
Yeah, and I mean this goes back historically. I mean, this is part of what in history is been called the libertarian exit fantasy, where people of libertarian orientation could just be like, oh, I'm dropping out of society and I'm going to do my own thing and I don't have to pay taxes and it's going to be great. This generation of people did not invent this. This has been going on in the 20th century for a long time and is reminiscent of the Ayn Rand books and all of that kind of philosophy. And the bottom line is that these people, they're, like they say, libertarians are like house cats. They don't realize just how much support they're getting from the environment around them, and, they think that they're just totally self-sufficient without realizing that, they're getting water and food and all these things from this vast system that supports them, which does need some support. So, it's kind of childish. It's adolescent fantasies. And there's a really good book written by a guy out of Cornell University named Ray Crabe, and the book is called Adventure Capitalism, and it outlines the history of these kinds of movements across the 20th century. And it's a lot of these libertarian types. It's people that are convinced that they need to stockpile guns and ammo and go live in the country with water and whatever. And it's craziness. It's not how real people are gonna live ultimately, and these things just generally don't work out. So it is it is this fantasy that you can just drop out of society and do something else. And I'll mention something else too, which you probably are well aware of, which is this concept called the network state, driven by Balaji Srinivasan, who's a good friend of Peter Thiel's and Curtis Yarvin's and all of those. And they did a conference in Amsterdam back in October of last year called the Network State Conference, which I think was the inaugural one. I actually attended that conference just to kind of get a sense of like what the vibe was and what all was going on. And, you know, a lot of it was kind of anodyne, hippy dippy, kind of feel good. Hey, you know, we should all get together and form a little commune that uses crypto and stuff like that. But some of it, you know, was really downright just straight up economic batshittery and gold buggery. Because again, they're talking about the, you know, the crash of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. defaulting on its debt and the rise of gold and crypto and you know, so what I call kind of financial eschatology, that, you know, there's this imminent doom in the realm of finance that's bound to happen because you know, the U.S. has been so profligate with its spending and its debt that, you know, there's a reckoning coming, which weirdly puts these people into the same exact camp as Christian Reconstructionists who believe the same exact thing. So what's happened, you know, as weird bedfellows, is you have this alignment between these crypto bros, many of whom are like totally atheist and not connected to any kind of religious stuff, and they're tied now at the hip with, you know, Christian nationalists, Christian Reconstructionists who are expecting imminent doom, and they're both rooting for imminent doom. And the thing about rooting for imminent doom is that sometimes you get it, you know. And so that's kind of what we're up against right now, is people pushing and hoping for a financial collapse, which is why when last week we had this, you know, brief stock market financial instability with Japan, you saw people saying, oh, it's all coming unraveled. It's going to happen. We're, you know, the stock market's going to go to zero and then Bitcoin's going to win and, you know, all this. And it's just, what? You know, so that's what's in play right now.
Yeah, one of the only times I talked to the guy who actually sold the Bitcoin mine to our county and city here, Chad Harris from Riot Blockchain, Riot Platforms, he mysteriously disappeared from the company in January of 2022. But he was at an economic development meeting, and one of the questions I've been asking from day one is like, what happens to all of this infrastructure when the Bitcoin Ponzi scheme, the house of cards, implodes? And I asked him that, and he's a Bitcoin maximalist. He said, what happens when the US banking system
right, nice little bit of whataboutism there.
And it really tells you the kind of, they truly like envision themselves as these feudal post-apocalyptic Bitcoin like lords, and we're all gonna be their little serfs because we weren't smart and we didn't buy in.
Correct.
But I want to point out that in 2021, when Texas had that big grid crash, you know, and some of the restaurants were open and serving, they weren't taking Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's exactly right. And your point about being the feudal lords is really well made, because the thing that just infuriates me about this is the idea that there is this, you know, what's almost an occult piece of knowledge. Like, if you get into Bitcoin, then you're gonna be one of the one that makes it, you know. And I'm sorry, you know, what about grandma, you know, who is sitting there with her 401k and her annuities and, you know, fixed income and bonds and whatnot? Does grandma get screwed in this equation unless she gets all of her assets into Bitcoin? That's the thing that we're forcing this issue. And it is just completely antisocial in that regard. You know, likewise, arguments to do things like, you know, vote on the blockchain are so anti-democratic, because at the end of the day, you know, what is democracy? Well, it's ruled by the demos. What is the demos? The demos is the people. You cannot get blockchain technology out at scale to everybody. You know, it is not an accessible technology to everybody. And that's what democracy is. So then you're talking about, oh, well, let's have rule by the some. Okay, well, which some? Oh, the ones that know about blockchain and, you know, Bitcoin or whatever and have a wallet, you know? Like, okay, that's how we're going to do democracy from now on, is people with weird tech fetishes. Like, okay, you know? So all of it is just sort of like antisocial, in my opinion. And I think that one of the great lies that's being told right now by this community is that they are not a niche phenomenon. I mean, it seems, sort of objects and bigger, or objects in mirror are larger, maybe larger than they appear. But in this case, I think the objects in mirror are smaller than they appear, because at the end of the day, they claim numbers as big as like 50 or 100 million people involved in crypto in the United States. I don't think that's true. I think maybe, that may be the total number of people who ever looked at it in some regard. But in terms of the number of people that are actively involved in it, it's got to be like 5% or less. And, that does not make a block for voting. It does not make a popular movement. It does not make like half the country or anything like that. It merely is an noxious vocal minority, and, a vocal minority that needs to be brought to heel, in my opinion.
I could not agree with you more. One of the things that I've been saying from day one, when I really started to understand crypto and Bitcoin, when they try to make these predatory inclusive statements about banking the unbanked, number one, most people are not banked because they don't have money. And number two, it is like inherently an elitist technology. You have to have the internet, you have to have money to gamble with, you have to know how to start a wallet. You need 100 hours of research to understand Bitcoin. And single moms and seniors living on a fixed income, they don't have time for that. They don't have the money for that. I like to point out that my 72-year-old mom is using her iPhone and Apple Pay for like 90% of her transactions. She's not using crypto, and crypto's 15 years old. Apple Pay's like 7 or 8 years old.
Right.
Oh, it's
If it was going to be popular, it had time to catch on, and
right.
it hasn't.
And if something's useful and it deserves to be mass adopted, it would have already. And so they are, this whole thing about all the money they're spending, and they started a fair shake pack, and they're trying to inflate their numbers and try to make the government think that there are way more crypto participants than there are, when there was, I think it was the Atlanta Fed did a survey, and it asked, I think like 2,500 people. And one of the questions was, were you using crypto for any non-speculative, actually as a transactive tool? And 0.04% said,
Yeah, that sounds about right. And maybe a couple of percent for speculative, it does not have the penetration that people claim it has. And also, like, if you undoubtedly are aware that, El Salvador has adopted Bitcoin as like an official thing, and Bukele there has been, a champion of this. But, all the information that I've heard from people like Zach Fox, who wrote the book Number Go Up, if you actually go to El Salvador and ask around, like, hey, do you take Bitcoin? They're like, no, I don't want anything to do with that stuff. It's crazy. Like, how about some nice pesos, or dollars, and I think that's kind of just where the rubber hits the road, is that as much as people want to push this as an ideological issue, and as much as it is effectively a weapon of war, and we can get more into how this aligns with Russia and China's geopolitical interests, but, this is a broadside attack on the dollar. And, it is being ramped up or amped up more than it probably should be, because it's not really as popular as people make it out to be. But yet, the more traction that it does get, and the higher that the price of like Bitcoin goes, and the more it attracts young men in particular who are like looking to get wealthy. Because again, I mean, part of the problem is we have a young man problem in this country, and young men feel like that they're left out. They don't have good options for getting and building wealth and getting good jobs necessarily. And so they look, and they also want to live crazy lifestyles and, date beautiful women and drive a Lamborghini and whatever. And, they think that the shortest pathway to that is either through like crypto speculation or shitcoins or, whatever. And for some of them, it has given the appearance of working out. Now, I suspect for most of them, it hasn't. And for a very large number, it's probably been very negative, because it basically helps foster a gambling addiction. And so, we're going to end up, when this finally crashes, which it hopefully will, with a generation of young men who wasted their 20s and 30s screwing with gambling instead of building businesses or skills or, a life. And I think it's going to come back to bite us really hard, because then you've got a bunch of people in their mid-30s who are severely disillusioned and are open to being radicalized further by other things, which, could be really bad. So it's a huge strategic societal error on our part to let this fester. It is a wound that is disproportionately affecting young men. I mean, there's women involved too, but I think your anecdotal experience probably matches with mine, that this is mostly a young male phenomenon, some older males too. And a lot of the women that are involved are sort of involved because, they want to be attached to men that are successful. Maybe I'm being too generalizing there. I don't know. But
Well, it
that's
is
certainly
right.
how it seems to me.
Yeah, and we definitely know for a fact it is very heavily male dominated. There's lots of studies out there that women. I also often cite the Pew survey that said 75% of Americans who are familiar with crypto don't trust it, and women, the gender gap, it's even more. Like, women do not want anything to do with this. I don't know if it's like we smell it a mile away, or if we don't have that risk, that men are more apt to participate in risky behavior, that kind of stuff. But yeah, women don't want anything to do with this. And then you have that like toxic masculinity sphere that is very much a
Yeah.
diagram, like uh Tate is it Andrew Tate and his brother.
Emblematic of that, yeah. And I think that the fact that the certain kinds of men are attracted to it, women look at that and go, well, what kind of dudes are into it? And then they go, oh, yeah, I really don't want to be anywhere near this. When I went to that Network State conference in Amsterdam, this happens a lot in the early days of tech conferences, but the line for the men's room was a mile long. The line for the women's room, it was no problem. And of course, in normal events where it's a normal gender balance, the women's room line is much longer, because it takes longer or whatever. So, it's so dramatically out of whack in terms of balance and sort of diversity and whatnot. Although I will say that it's attracted, it's not just like white dudes. It's, there's black dudes and Hispanic dudes and all kinds of different people from around the world that are attracted to this. But it is predominantly men, aged like 21 to 40, with outliers on both sides. But yeah, predominantly that demographic.
And I don't know if this is, I often, and this is very, painting with a broad brush, but I also talk about the sociopathy in the industry, and women are a little more empathetic, compassionate, and you kind of have to look past the fact that if I'm making money in crypto, somebody else is losing it. And the people that tell you have fun staying poor, there's not a lot of compassion and empathy there. So
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah,
of
I think you have to be kind of a weird woman to adopt that mindset. Just in my experience, that's what I've observed.
and to speak about the radicalization, I think that crypto is an entry point to radicalization. There's so much overlap with the manosphere, with extremism. I often
Totally.
also point out that January 6th, there was like a $500,000 or $600,000 donation in Bitcoin to the January 6ers. Like, there is a
And
lot
that's
of,
what we know about. I mean,
yeah,
there's probably
right.
a lot of other crypto supporting all of that as well.
Yeah. So I really worry, like you, about young men becoming radicalized and what that can lead to down the road, especially if they don't have any jobs and prospects and any wealth that they've built up because they were degenerate gamblers. They call themselves this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just,
It's worrisome. Yeah. No. And, I feel like that you also see in the realm of crypto a heavy reliance on language and little terms. So there's the whole GM, GN, good morning, good night, wag me, we're all going to make it. There's, I mean, countless little, there's HODL, HODL, hold on for dear life, or a mistyping of hold. And also this cult pressure that comes from pure, really, the whole idea of community is another word for cult.
yeah.
And they rely heavily on the concept of community. And one of the things that I've had to do in all of the research that I've done on extremism is to really understand cult dynamics really, really well. And I've come up with, I've read most of the literature on that topic, and I've also come up with kind of my own mental models for how to think about that. And what you find is that, in the realm of, let's say, destructive cults, when the social capital between the participants becomes so tight that they basically become more concerned about the group's well-being than societal well-being, that is one marker of a cult. The other marker that you see, and this is stuff that's been identified by people like Steve Hassan, who's a big expert on cults, as well as Robert J. Lifton before him, who wrote really good literature about kind of thought control in the context of totalitarian China. You see pressure for leaving the group. You don't want people to leave. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure put on people to stay within the community, to stay holders of crypto, because at the end of the day, everybody knows that if somebody gets disillusioned and cashes out, that harms the whole group. So there's a tremendous in-group pressure to take on what are effectively sociopathic behaviors that harm the rest of society but benefit the in-group. And, I'm sorry, that's a cult. The other thing that you see in cults, and this is something that Robert J. Lifton identified, is the whole thing with the language stuff and thought terminating cliches. So, have fun staying poor. That's a thought terminating cliche. Somebody that might be questioning, with real reason and like, well, why is this happening when, I thought this was how it worked. And, if there's fear amongst the in-group that this person is going to leave the in-group, then you can hit them with this thought terminating cliche, which is, oh, well, have fun staying poor, instead of engaging in more thoughtful debate or actually questioning the doctrine or anything like that. So in that respect, this thing operates like a cult. And I'm sorry, folks take offense to that. That's just a fact. And, I think from that standpoint, it's very harmful. And it has to radicalize people, because ultimately that's how you get them to stay in the in-group, is to exert pressure on them to stay in the in-group. And I'm sorry, that's radicalization. Now, whether or not that leads to them committing acts of violence or taking on, let's say, adjacent forms of radicalization, that may remain to be seen. And I'm sure that there's plenty of people that are participating in this that, would not participate in political violence or something like that. And that's fine. But the issue is that if this thing goes south, which it may very well, or it gets co-opted, or, people lose their shirts, then those people are basically separated from normal society. They have a great deal of resentment towards normal society, and they have, perhaps motive to act on that resentment, which I think is kind of where you get your school shooters and your bombers and, other people, is people holding those kinds of resentments and with nothing to lose. So, this is a bad situation, and we should never have let ourselves get into it.
And I'm worried we're already kind of halfway there, because the wider world has seen Bitcoin for what it is and crypto for what it is. And now, they're like, oh, nobody wants to talk about crypto anymore. Nobody wants to talk about Bitcoin anymore. Or my family does, tells me not to talk about it anymore.
Well, they're running out of new marks to bring into the Ponzi scheme also, which is not great,
To kind of change subjects, because you did bring it up, and I don't want to, this has been such a good conversation, and we could probably talk for a really long time, but I'd like to also point out constantly that, number one, this technology came from China. China kicked them out, Bitcoin miners and crypto, but they are the main beneficiaries of this, because they sell the Bitcoin miner, they manufacture and sell these crypto machines. And also Russia is second behind America in Bitcoin mining, and that is largely to evade sanctions that have been placed upon them by global governments for their invasion of Ukraine. Can you talk about China and Russia's what they're doing with crypto, and how, what your views are on what's
Sure. Well, so I think the first thing to understand is, beyond just the crypto piece, is what are Russia and China doing? They are basically trying to challenge the position that the U.S. has had for decades of, U.S. hegemony, which has really been driven primarily by the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. That was kind of cemented, and with a little bit of fits and starts in 1971 when Nixon, unpegged the dollar from gold for international transfers. And effectively, what you ended up with was a situation where the dollar was kind of tied to a barrel of oil, and it became the primary mechanism through which, oil was traded and held and everything else. So you have this kind of oil dollar relationship that has allowed the US, by virtue of having the Federal Reserve and the ability to, sort of make more dollars as needed, put it in a position of great power globally. And, in broad strokes, and you can get into a long list of details around this, there's a lot of countries that think that they would like to stop that. They would, want to change things around so that you have, instead of the US having so much concentrated power, you have a more, what you might call a multipolar world where China and Russia and several other countries might have more, control about what goes on. So, this concept of the BRICS countries, which has been thrown around a lot in the last several years, really started in around 2002 as a concept in a paper written by a Goldman Sachs analyst who came up with this shorthand for like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which in turn now has added in a bunch of other sort of countries into this very informal organization. It's not really an alliance. It's not really a firm organization, although they sort of have meetings and throw parties and stuff and talk about stuff, apparently. But in broad strokes, it is an alliance against the West. It is an alliance against the United States and against the European Union. So as in effect, it's broadly a currency alliance against the dollar and against the euro and other, central banks that may want to just continue to exist kind of in the dollar realm. So what they think they're going to do is to create new currency regimes rooted in, either assets like gold and silver or other metals, or even other commodities like oil, which of course brings in the Gulf cooperating countries, states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all that. Also crypto. And I think they see crypto as kind of a bridge from kind of the current regime to this new regime, which will maybe exist more on a mixture of crypto and dollar, gold, and what other things. And you might also see, digital assets, cryptocurrencies that are backed by, physical assets like gold or oil or what have you. So the issue here is that, these countries, Russia and China, as well as some of the others, India and whatnot, have access to a lot of natural resources. And if you started to build currencies that were based on those natural resources, then they're not in a terrible position. Now, you can get into long economic arguments that are sort of above my pay grade about whether that's reasonable or workable. But in terms of like idea, that's the idea that they have. And unfortunately, that idea is very appealing to a lot of people, including to a lot of the domestic sort of Bitcoin community in the United States that view the US dollar, and this is where we get back into the libertarians and the Christian nationalists that I mentioned earlier, is they view the dollar and the Federal Reserve as fundamentally illegitimate. So if you wanted to have an alternative to the dollar and the Federal Reserve that they consider to be more legitimate, then you would want this kind of asset-backed or scarce hard money kind of alternative that is being brewed up. So, up until fairly recently, I think for the last 3 years, Bitcoin mining has actually been illegal in Russia. However, it's been happening anyway. But beginning, I think, November 1st of this year, they've actually passed a new law just in the last couple of weeks that will legalize Bitcoin mining in Russia as you mentioned, a response to the Western sanctions. And I mean, this is one of many things that has been sprouting up in response to Western sanctions. So on the one hand, I think that the Western sanctions have been totally necessary and we should probably do more of them. On the other hand, it is forcing the creation of this like back channel financial system that if the more that networked it gets with these BRICS countries and the GCC states, the stronger it gets. And so what we're basically ending up with, whether we like it or not, and whether it's a good idea or not, is this bifurcated world that exists between, say, the dollar system, the Federal Reserve, and the SWIFT transfer network, and then this other alternative shadow system, which ultimately the claim that Putin rests his logic on here, which isn't totally insane, is the idea that the U.S. and the European Union represents maybe 1.1 or so billion people. And so his argument is that 1.1 billion, which he calls the golden billion, which is sort of like he thinks it's a big conspiracy to have the golden billion controlling everybody else, is up against the remainder of the planet, the other 7 billion or so. And so the argument here, which again is not totally insane, it may be wrong, but it's not insane, is that if you have an economy that takes that long tail of the 7 billion and pits it against the short tail ahead of the 1 billion, you might actually have some kind of parity there. And it would put the U.S. kind of in its place because, A, if we lose our status as, having the reserve currency, then everything becomes much more expensive for the United States. And we end up not being able to throw around our military influence as much as we have, which of course they see as an unalloyed good. And secondly, it's getting revenge. It's, if you look at what happened to the USSR in 1991, one of the things that happened was that they basically went through a financial attack like this, where the ruble just imploded and they had massive hyperinflation and the whole thing became a huge mess, which then was sort of reconstituted in this reconstructionist mode under, Boris Yeltsin and then subsequently Putin. But it was a tremendous psychological wound that the USSR went through. And Putin feels as though he suffered that wound personally. This was personal to him. And so a lot of what we're going through now is revenge for what happened in 1990, 1991. And, okay, but I think the issue is not enough people see that that's kind of like the big picture thing that's happening. But if you look even just a little bit under the surface, it's all written out. Like there's literature all about how this is going to work and why they're doing it. And I in my most recent column for Washington Spectator, which is called Peter Thiel and the American Apocalypse, there's a reference in that column to a book written by Sergei Glaziev, who's actually the economist who's now leading up this BRICS effort. And he wrote a book in 2016 called The Last World War, the U.S. to Move and Lose, I think it is. And it talks about, an attack on the dollar and how to take down the United States. So I guess what's frustrating for me is that this stuff is all out there and it's happening. And people are still like, I don't really know where things are going. Well, no, it's all written out right there. You just need to read it, And so I'm trying to raise awareness around that. And, we have this big debt ceiling deadline coming up on January 2nd, 2025, which, we have this every 12 to 18 months in the U.S. right now where we have to reauthorize the national debt. And normally we do that, but conditions being whatever they may be at that moment, we don't really know what a January 2nd, 2025 is going to look like. There's a lot of different ways that could play out. So if in Q1 or Q2 of 2025, we have a situation where we default on the debt, you're looking at, something like 6 million jobs lost minimum and like a $15 trillion, destruction of wealth. Like it would be catastrophic, and it's something from which the U.S. might never recover, but would be exactly the kind of revenge attack that Putin would be hoping for. So what we kind of need to focus on at the moment is making sure that default doesn't happen. And of course, people say, oh, well, they always authorize it. It never really happens. Well, except for when it does happen. And that's where you get this concept of a black swan event, is that things that don't normally happen eventually maybe sometimes happen. And we need to the reason why these things often don't happen is because people like me and others who are concerned about it speak up and stuff gets done. And if we just coast, then it's not going to get done and we may have a bad situation. So that's why you always have to speak up to keep the black swans from happening.
When I call crypto Bitcoin seditious, treasonous, anti-American, the Bitcoin maximalists literally say they want the US dollar and the US banking system to fail, and they want Bitcoin to be the next global reserve currency. So
Right.
number one, it's a total fantasy. It's not feasible because of its obvious limits, like 7 transactions per second globally. But it's also like they're telling us straight up, they are telling us exactly who they are, exactly what their aims are. And it's not good, because if you take that to its, final end, we're talking about accelerationism. We're talking about people who want to see the whole thing burn down. And
Yeah.
that's real cute rhetoric, but in like reality, when the rubber hits the road, that is a lot of people being harmed. And
Yeah. And
it's
again,
not power.
it's completely antisocial because
Yeah.
it really totally attacks people that aren't tuned to this, and even people like you and me who I'm sure have some means and are not unaware of this, but I'm ideologically opposed to participating in it in any way. And people ask me like, well, how do I hedge against this risk? And I say, well, spread the word that this is a problem and let's keep it from becoming a problem. And but there's no universe where like putting money into crypto is like a reasonable hedge to this, because at the end of the day, any participation you have in it is fueling the project. And so therefore there's no ethical way. Now, I mean, if you want to violate your ethics or whatever and be practical, yeah, that's up to you. But in terms of, ethical ways to oppose this, the only thing you can do is to try to lobby for it to get stopped and to get shrunk and, kept in check. And I don't even mind if this stuff exists at some small scale and people want to play with their dumb little, tech toys. It's like, weird board games or something. Like if you want to do that and that's like what makes you happy on Friday nights, great. But it shouldn't be something that harms other people, right? And that's the thing that concerns me about this. And part of and this is something we can amplify a little bit here, is that I'll share something negative maybe about crypto online and people will say, well, I've always known it was a scam. It's only good for criminals and money laundering. And I'll say, look, you don't get it. It is not enough to know that this is a scam. You have to know that this can actually harm you as a non-participant. And that does not get through enough to people, that this is hurting the rest of us just by existing. And the more it grows and gets bigger, the more it has the potential to harm everybody. And, that message has to get out to people.
I wholeheartedly agree. We are like constantly telling folks like, don't just be crypto critical, like join us. We need help. There's plenty of stuff that the National Coalition and the Texas Coalition needs assistance with. So
Yep.
like, yeah, like be on Twitter and talk about how stupid this is, but like get off of Twitter and help move the needle, because they're sort of winning right now. Like they actually,
Yeah, they're moving forward at a good clip.
Ryan Selkis just tweeted at Molly White, we won again, because one of their
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
pro crypto candidates beat an anti crypto candidate. This is really scary times, y'all. Like this isn't hyperbole. They are saying everything right there out in the open, and we absolutely should not tolerate it. And we shouldn't be we shouldn't just be sitting on our laurels. And because you mentioned South Africa and Peter Thiel, I have to ask you, we are so like a little bit running on time, but please, can you talk about what Elon Musk has been doing with Twitter lately, the right-wing radicalization of Elon Musk in real time on Twitter for all of us to see, and Peter Thiel and the elections, and if you can give us a little.
Yeah, I can try to give a quick snapshot. So, yeah, I think everybody has seen that Elon Musk is kind of leading the vanguard in terms of right-wing extremism, and he's been called out quite a bit for helping to fuel the racially motivated riots in the UK that have been taking place the last several days, which mostly are based in just complete disinformation and nonsense. But it's nonsense and disinformation that Musk has been very happy to amplify. So I noticed back in around 2020, when I was working really hard on the 2020 election situation and disinformation around that a lot of it was centering around networks connected to Musk. And that right underneath the surface, there was this kind of Musk center of gravity that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was quite obvious then that this was a problem. And so, I basically, based on the signals I was getting from looking at the channels that I was observing closely, I said, okay, we got to keep an eye on Musk and see where this goes. If it turns, and what was crazy was in 2020, I had put in an order for a lease on a Tesla Model 3, and I was like, oh, I don't really feel great about this, but I'm sure I'm just overreacting. I'm sure it's going to be fine. And so over the course of my lease, I began to see that, like, this has to stop. Like,
Much
Musk was
effect
getting
on.
really out of hand. And so, like, I was like, oh crap, my worst case hypothesis about Musk was right. And he just kept getting more and more extreme. And so in about February, April timeframe 2021, I put out a memo to a bunch of people that were connected in with government and National Security Council and stuff. And I said, Elon Musk is going to try to attack the dollar with Peter Thiel. We don't know when it's going to go down, but it's going to involve manipulation of the stock market. It's going to involve crypto, and it's going to involve, just generally trying to destabilize the economy and also accelerating right-wing extremism. And it was pretty detailed, and I passed it around, and people were like, what? Yeah, it sounds crazy. And I was like, well, it maybe so, but just wait and see. And so what's happened is that this has all now come to pass, pretty much exactly as I predicted it would in 2021. And, he, I think to a lot of people assume that he's out to make money, and that he would never do something totally rash because it would affect his wealth or whatever. And I'm here to tell you, no, he does not care about anything other than his weird goals of like getting to Mars and feeding his ego and everything else. So when he bought Twitter, a lot of people are like, oh, he doesn't really want to buy Twitter. He's trying to back out of it. I'm like, no, he doesn't. Any theater involving the price or backing out, that was just drama, just to throw out there for fun. This is a huge game for him. And when he actually bought Twitter, for $44 billion, he could have paid $100 billion. It doesn't matter because he doesn't intend to pay it back. And the reason he doesn't intend to pay it back is because that deal was denominated in dollars. And he intends to destroy the dollar as much as he possibly can, to inflict maximum damage on the dollar so that this deal just melts down, and or the company just goes bankrupt after. Like, I describe it kind of like a booster rocket. It's like once it's used its purpose to get to the next phase, then the rocket is disposable, and you can just throw Twitter away. It doesn't even matter if it succeeds or fails, which is why all of this stuff that around revenue and everything else, like the whole company is imploded financially, and they're suing their advertisers. I mean, none of it makes any sense at all financially from a business perspective, but that's the point. It doesn't have to, because this isn't a standard business. This is an information warfare operation designed to get his ideological project onto the next level, right? So when you start to see it from that perspective, it kind of makes sense. Now with my lease, when that expired in 2023, I got rid of the Tesla and I got a Mercedes electric vehicle instead. And my son says, well, you realize you've gone from the neo-Nazis to the OG Nazis. And I'm like, well, yeah, but the OG Nazis are a little less active now,
Yeah.
and they have a nice car, but yeah, they're not up in my face trying to like take over the world at the moment. So, that's kind of the deal with Elon. And, I wish it wasn't like that, but that seems to be where we are.
Wow. Yeah. And Peter Thiel and JD Vance, it is so overt that like they're like these South African dudes are literally trying to buy a vice president of the United
Yeah.
States.
And to install him as their Red Caesar, he's the avatar for the both of them, really. And I should point out that there's really strong overlaps between Thiel and Musk. Obviously, they've had a little bit of a rivalry over the years. They haven't always seen eye to eye, but they agree on the big things. And if you know the Latin phrase ad astra per aspera, which is to the stars through difficulties, they have named all of their little projects after that. So the PAC that helped fund a lot of the campaigns that Thiel finance was called Per Aspera Policy. Elon Musk's school for kids in Texas at Starbase is called Ad Astra School. And obviously connecting dots here or whatever, but there's a deep and broad ideological alignment between these guys. And yes, I think the South African kind of like mindset is material here. Peter, of course, spent time both in Germany and in South Africa. And, the South African kind of apartheid culture mindset is just very hierarchical. Very much, there's winners and losers, and that's why we need to keep score, which is why something like Bitcoin is so important to these people because in order to establish hierarchy, you have to know who's on top, right? And the only way you can really know that is with hard currency. And so that's that point of view. That is that worldview being manifested through gold buggery, through slavery, and through Bitcoin. It's the same mindset across the board. And apartheid.
Wow. Holy smokes. Thank you so much. I really do feel like I've got a couple new brain wrinkles. That was quite the story, the arch that we took, the historical path, and it kind of really does come full circle. Can you
It really
tell
does.
folks, yeah. Can you tell folks where they can find your work, how they how can they contact you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find my writing at washingtonspectator.org, which is a sort of news publication that's been going since 1974 in DC. And my column there is called The Wide Angle. You can also find me on X at Dave Troy, and on Mastodon at Dave Troy at Toad, TOAD.social. And I also have some links to like my email address and other things at my website, which is davetroy.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and for that incredible lesson and shift in perspective. Like you really put some thoughts into my brain that I'm gonna have to chew on now.
Yeah,
Thank you
there's a
so
lot
much.
there. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you
And
so much for having me on.
I feel like an hour's like not even long enough. We could probably talk about this for all day. And
Some other time, we'll continue the conversation.
for sure. Definitely maybe when your book comes out, you come back.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Hey, folks. Appreciate you joining us again. This has been Jackie Sawicki with the Proof of Waste podcast. Our guest today was Dave Troy. And thank you so much. Please subscribe, hit the notification bells, all that good stuff. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
If anything you saw today makes you want to act, we need your help. Join us. Fill out the form below, and we'll get you onboarded into the National Coalition Against Crypto Mining. Thank you so much for watching.